Attention listeners, ahead are spoilers.
Hello, and welcome to the Movie Trap. You find yourself at the threshold in the middle of the Movie Trap with me, Russell Carlson, and also Chris Borth.
Ducks have cloacas.
And also with me, Zach Powers.
It's a duck blur.
There, we'll get into the cross-duck universes here in a later bit. But anyway, if this is your first time joining us on the Movie Trap, the essential point of this is that one of the three hosts you've just met picks a theme, and then each of us picks a movie based on that theme. At the end of the three movies, we will vote on which movie was the best or whatever, and whichever movie wins, that host gets to pick the next theme. Each of us gets 10 points to start out with, but we also have some bonus points that we get to divvy out for whatever reason we see for we want to. And that pretty much brings us to where we are now. Previously on the Movie Trap, we started Chris Borth's theme of failed franchises with The Dark Universe's 2017's The Mummy, which was something. And since we were talking a lot about Marvel and how to launch franchises, I decided to surprise us with Marvel's first attempt in feature-length films with 1986's George Lucas's unsung masterpiece, Howard the Duck. So with that in mind, Zach, why don't you get on down to Cleveland and show us what the fuck Howard the Duck is all about.
Howard the Duck is a 1986 comedy film directed by William Huck, frequent George Lucas collaborator. George Lucas was big on getting this little guy made.
I just realized when you said it that way that his name was also a pun.
Yeah. Huck, Duck, yeah, all of it. It stars Leah Thompson and Jeffrey Jones and Tim Robbins, and also, I guess, so Howard the Duck. Ed Gale is the suit performer. He also does Chucky in the Child's Play movies, and Chip Zien is the voice. Who the fuck is Chip Zien? Your guess is as good as mine, frankly. He did some Broadway, but he didn't do much else. Regardless. Howard the Duck is about a young duck man who lives in a world full of ducks, imaginatively called Duck World. It's very similar to Earth. They have parodies of all of our Earth films, like Raiders of the Lost Ark and Flashdance, which is called like Feather Dance or some shit. All that,
including Playboy. But they call it something
Playboy.
else.
There is a Playboy. One day, after coming home from his new job, Howard is sucked into a vortex to, I think, another world. I don't think it's another dimension. I think the Earth is in the same.
That's right.
It's just another world. It's through space to another world. And he winds
early
up
introduction to the Marvel's sense of the cosmic. It's just like the Thors and the whatever else.
That's right. The Doctor Stranges, all the Eternals.
Planet Hulk.
You know it.
Yeah. So, but just to be clear, it's not like this is an alternate Earth. This is another planet somewhere in the universe that is extremely similar to Earth. And the only difference is that ducks were the main evolutionary stepping stone instead of monkeys towards human beings. Otherwise, basically identical.
Totally.
Regardless, they have two moons also.
It's Lucas. He's got to have the two moons.
Gotta have the two moons. Regardless, he ends up in Cleveland, Ohio, where he is, harassed by a number of young ruffians, including like a female biker gang called Satan's Sluts. He eventually finds himself in a back alley when a young girl rocker, Leah Thompson, comes by. She is being harassed by two young men And clearly this is about to become an attempted rape, which is a strong vibe to bring to Howard the Duck. But Howard intervenes with some quack foo and saves young Leah Thompson, who in this movie is named Beverly. And she brings him back to her apartment to stay the night after he explains he's a duck from another world. I don't know. People take that pretty well.
There's some pretty quick acceptance in this movie. If anything else, I get the sense that Cleveland is like the bastion of liberal acceptance at this point.
Sure. Except for all of
what a shithole it is.
Except for the fact that it's full of thugs who want to rape or murder people at the drop of a hat.
Yep.
Well, I mean, sure, but that's probably, just look at the movie and how the movie reacts to what it's shown us. It's just assuming that this is a normal day in the life of Cleveland.
Yeah, pretty much.
3-foot duck wandering around. Yep.
Beverly tries to get help from her friend who works at a museum or university. I'm not sure which. A young Tim Robbins, but she quickly learns he is merely the janitor and not actually a scientist. So his help is not invaluable. Howard decides he's probably not going to be able to get home and goes on a job hunt. Picking up a series of odd jobs at spas and the like.
Let's be clear. It's a swinger sex spa. He goes to like an unemployment line, and that's where they send him. They don't go like, here's a grocery store. They're like, here's this weird seedy sex club where someone's going to try to drown you.
And the person who works at the unemployment office assumes that he looks like a duck in an attempt to grift the unemployment system. That classic con that we've all heard of. The welfare ducks were big in the era of H.W. Bush.
Yeah, we could talk about that. There's definitely some Geico caveman-esque crossover here that we should get into. But let's let you keep going.
Yep, we got to keep going. Howard ends up at a club where Beverly's band is playing. And overhears their manager kind of trying to pimp them out to another group of men, like for sex. Howard beats him up like by sticking a knife through his hoop earring and holding him to the bar, and eventually gets him to resign as their manager. They go back to Beverly's apartment, and he becomes the new band manager. And they almost initiate sex when suddenly Tim Robbins and, speaking of perverts, Jeffrey Jones show up to reveal that they were the ones who created the device that brought Howard over from another planet. And they're interested in trying to see if they can get him sent home. So they go back to the laboratory, but the special MacGuffin laser doesn't work right. And it seems like maybe something else is being brought to Earth. At this point, the movie changes dramatically in tone for the remainder.
For sure.
So the Jeffrey Jones character, Dr. Jennings, is possessed by like a space demon called a Dark Overlord of the universe, and is slowly transforming. It's very, very, very Ghostbusters inspired, pretty clearly, in my opinion. They go to a diner and realize that Jennings wants to bring more Dark Overlords to Earth to take over the planet. But some truckers insult Howard, and ultimately they are about to eat him, I guess. They're going to cut off his head and eat him.
Yeah, he's getting lynched, kind of. It's weird. They're going to cook him.
Kind of.
But also, the thing is with the Dark Overlord, you're saying it as though they found it out. Like they had to go through some challenge to find it. They just sit with him across at a diner and go,
in a diner.
So what's your plan? Oh, I'm going to bring all the evil. And they just kind of keep going. They don't
it's very much, he's possessed. Like when I say it's like Ghostbusters, it's like when Dana is possessed by Zool. It's a totally different person. Like they're open about what they are. Like there's no, it is what it is. But the Dark Overlord inadvertently saves him by destroying the diner and runs off with Beverly. Anyway, Phil and Howard decide they need to, sort of save Beverly. So while being pursued by police, they find a little airplane and they fly around for a little while. They get back to the laboratory. So the Dark Overlord is going to put another Dark Overlord into Beverly's body using the space laser. But Howard and Phil arrive and they save her. There's a crazy nuclear laser neuron gun thing that Howard gets a hold of. And they fire it at Jennings and it kicks the Dark Overlord out of his body. But now it's, outside of his body is a big ass monster. They shoot it again and it kills them and destroys the laser. And the other Dark Overlords can't come. But Howard is now stuck on Earth, where he decides to become Beverly's manager and also perform with them on stage. Their sexual relationship is ambiguous.
I don't think it's that ambiguous.
Okay.
I don't think it's that ambiguous.
They don't explicitly show them
No,
engaging.
they don't.
Well, we have definitely gotten through this plot now, so we can get into it.
Yeah.
So that is just, since you guys are talking about the sex, I'm going to just say that is one of the most uncomfortable circumstances in this movie. Like, the presence of sex in this story was one of the most confusing aspects. It would be like someone trying to fuck either Chip or Dale. It's weird. It's so uncomfortable.
I noticed there's two moments. I think one at the end and one during the flirtation scene where she is supposed to kiss Howard, but in both cases it's behind a screen or they cut away because I think Leah Thompson was like, I don't want to kiss.
How does that even work?
But
how do I even do that?
I'll also note one of my favorite things is Leah Thompson, you may know from Back to the Future, where she is also rescued from an attempted rape and in love with someone who would be very gross to consummate a relationship with. So she does have a type.
Yeah. Oh, man.
For what it's worth, the whole interspecies love story is straight from the comic books. It's straight from Gerber's. I mean, the whole Beverly character in issue 2 of Howard the Duck Howard the Duck was a side character in one of Marvel's Man-Thing episodes written by Steve Gerber. And Gerber, it was really popular, apparently. Everybody loved Howard the Duck. So he started to make his own comic books centering only on Howard. The rest of Marvel hated it. I mean, the rest of Marvel thought, because he was basically, the point of Howard the Duck was almost to make fun of comic books. It was almost supposed to make fun of Spider-Man and Daredevil and all that stuff. And
it was absurdist nonsense, yeah.
Pretty much, yeah. And there was, some dives to our philosophy.
It's probably similar in concept to, I'm sure many of our listeners / viewers have seen Into the Spider-Verse, but the Spider-Ham character from that is probably meant to be very similar in tone.
Sure. Even though I think Spider-Ham was more for kids, whereas Howard the Duck was not. Howard the Duck was always meant to be this sort of in his very first panel of Howard the Duck, he's talking about, well, I'm going to kill myself. It's a lot darker and a lot more. Steve Gerber was kind of a weird dude. He was part of that new school of Marvel comic book writers with Jim Starlin and everybody. They were kind of under the new regime of Cadence and everything like that. So Marvel cancels Howard the Duck because Marv Wolfman, the editor-in-chief, fucking hated it. But they were deluged with complaints and no, bring back Howard. We want Howard, and it worked and Steve Gerber stayed on it. And it wasn't until, throughout Marvel's history, Stan Lee and Marvel have always been trying to get Spider-Man, a movie about Spider-Man or Ant-Man made. When they finally got a deal with Universal regarding Howard the Duck, they didn't tell Steve Gerber, and Gerber sued Marvel. And it was in pretty much legal trouble with them for about 10 years. And the courts obviously sided with Marvel, saying it was a work for hire thing. That's a whole other story of how comic book industry treats writers and creators. But I think what needs to be known about this particular title and Steve Gerber in general, I mean, is that the how, as strange as this movie was and as strange as Howard the Duck as a concept is, the comic books are a lot stranger. You know, in issue 2, Beverly does get raped. And all of his villains are almost like these. They're almost comical. Like the first villain is called Pro Rata, the cosmic accountant. You know, like there's a lot more weirder, the Hell Cow and stuff like that. Like there's a lot weirder stuff here. And I feel
what time period did this come out?
1976 was the first Howard the Duck single title.
Okay, that actually kind of falls in line with some of the stuff, because there were animals, like comic books with anthropomorphized creatures and things like that had become popular. I think even like Star Wars had like a giant alien bunny rabbit that appeared in their stories. But this one always felt to me like somebody who grew up reading either like The Shadow or The Phantom or Dick Tracy decided they wanted to do, The Spirit. They wanted to do a play on that. And they just got super surreal and weird. So, you know, that might be more acceptable as a comic, but
I think it probably would be. Yeah. For one thing, you know, the way you could look up pictures of Howard the Duck, the comic book character, and part of the reason that this movie is so off-putting is the costume is weird.
I'm glad you brought that up.
You look up the comic book character and he looks like a cartoon. Like everybody's a cartoon. And I think that helps a great deal in selling this weird surrealist thing. Even briefly, like the new MCU movies have had Howard the Duck appear a couple of times in the Guardians movies and in Endgame when all the people show up. He's a cameo Easter egg in the background. And he's a CGI character who looks a lot more like his comic book counterpart than he looks like this weird costume.
Part of that was because of Disney. Like, I guess when they did this, they had an issue where they had to go back and forth with Disney to make sure there wasn't enough of a crossover between how he looked and how Donald looked or any of those characters. So they kept changing the face, and that's why he has sort of that weird look. Like, he looks like one of Donald's, like, nephews that has grown up bad. Like, he's weird.
I'll say, but now Disney owns all them
all
ducks,
of it, so
both
we don't
those
see
ducks.
the problem. Yeah,
and I could go into this now or later, but I think Howard the Duck has done a lot more for Disney than Donald Duck ever did.
You're gonna have to. Wow, I can't imagine that being the case.
Do you want me to explain this right now?
I'm all ears
because I've seen most of the people's careers that have just been crashed. So take it away.
This was a big passion project for George Lucas. We mentioned that right before he made it. He did this big expansion on Skywalker Ranch, $50 million, and he was like, "That's going to get paid for by Howard the Duck money." Mm-hmm. Well, this movie burned. It did terrible at the box office, bombed. So he didn't get the money he needed off the Howard the Duck, the franchise he was thinking about making that he expected. So Steve Jobs comes in and says, "Tell you what, I will buy Lucas Animated Studios to pay for these renovations for however much money. And, that way you at least get to come up green this year." And Lucas agrees. So these LucasArts Animated Studios goes over to Apple, where it is renamed Pixar. Mm-hmm. Because of Howard the Duck, Pixar is created, and Pixar has done a hell of a lot more for Disney than I think Donald Duck ever did.
Wow.
I never put that together, but that is you get a point because I now understand where that came from. So if I have any points to give, you get one.
You do. We
all have points to give.
Oh, yeah. I should probably run down the points real quick. So real quick, dear listener, apologies. Chris Bohr, if you have 11 points for final voting and you have 2 to give away, now you only have 1. I have 11 points to vote, and I have 2 points to give, and Zach has 11 points with 2 points to give, except now you have 12 points, Zach.
Okay.
One of the things I actually wanted to kind of comment on, since you said what it did for Disney, I'd like to say what it didn't do for Star Wars. This film, like, his particular production partners on this were people he knew since college. Like, these were people that had written and worked on American Graffiti. And evidently, he just
and the Temple of Doom as well.
Yeah, one of the writers. And he stayed super, like, close to these people. And every once in a while, after the initial like bloom of Star Wars, he would try making other films and other genres and things. So, you know, you have like Tucker that came out that was like a Francis Ford Coppola project that's, you know, bombed horribly but was like super well received by critics. But with this particular couple, you had Howard the Duck, and then a couple years later you had Radioland Murders that also bombed. And most of the arguments I've heard around this is that's one of the reasons why it took so long to get a Star Wars sequel made. Because he kept doing these projects, and when they would bomb, it would put back production years.
The thing, I think George Lucas, this is only semi on topic, but you know, he was a big part of why this movie got made. George Lucas is a guy who's like a billionaire, and I think in his heart he's always been miserable, because I think he wanted to be like a real fucking filmmaker. Like he wanted to be like his contemporaries like Coppola and Spielberg and Scorsese,
yeah.
And all he could ever do was this one fucking franchise that he didn't intend to be his entire life. And it's made him billions of dollars. He's one of the richest people on the planet because of it. But he'll never be the kind of artist, I think in his heart, he always really wanted to be. And yeah.
I totally agree.
And it's totally trying to run away from that type, but yet you do movies like Howard the Duck. Like it doesn't track, you know. Like I sort of understand. Your point about Ghostbusters, I think, is well taken, because I think that they saw Ghostbusters and kind of horror comedy. We can pull this off. With
the second half of this is so Ghostbusters-esque.
Yeah, and even, you know, I'm glad you brought up the animatronic duck for Howard, because a lot of the critiques at the time, because critics hated this movie for a lot of a good reason, but like a lot of it was that they didn't find the duck that believable. And I didn't really have a problem with the animatronics of Howard. I thought he looked okay. I think my biggest problem was his voice. You know, apparently the voice was tacked on right at the end. They had no idea who was going to play Howard, which is a problem. Immediately, if you don't know who's going to play the voice of your main fucking character while you're shooting the movie, that's a problem. That's a huge problem.
It's not a no. I'm surprised by how unknown this person is. Like I said, they did a few Broadway things. They were in United 93 apparently, but like I'd never heard of this person. And it seems like with a cast that has a lot of like pretty decently known people, you'd line up somebody to do Howard's voice. I
have a feeling that there's a reason. I have a feeling there's a reason that he's a nobody who does the voice. I have a feeling that if you shot this whole film, got it edited, and then brought people in to do the looping, most of the people who would come in and see this would go, "Oh, I don't want to be attached to this," and say no. So even though they had people who couldn't put a fig leaf over their face, it couldn't get away from them. Like, I always feel bad.
But that's why you get the voice before you go into production.
Yeah, yes. That's why you get them to sign the contract before they see the final product, you know, and then and at that point you're like, well, what's really the harm? I have to sit in an air conditioned room for a week and, you know, and try to match lines with a puppet.
I mean, it's clear that that's why they approached it as a technical feat rather than performance. They obviously were just looking at how to make the duck work. They weren't looking at how to make the performance be interesting or exciting to people.
Correct, because I was reading originally, Lucas, this was supposed to be an animated project, but because they signed on the deal with Universal, it had to be live action or some shit. I'm not real clear on how that goes. Animated probably would have been better, but if you didn't have the voice, if you were already kind of nebulous about the voice of Howard to begin with, I can't imagine that you would have done any better if it was animated.
I think that was like a contractual stipulation because Universal wanted to have a live action film for summer to compete with some of the other live action stuff. This film, I mean, you can kind of keep going, but this film, my question in general for you guys that maybe you can answer over the course of this is, who is this movie for? Who was supposed to watch this?
Good question, because I think that's part of the problem. That's another flaw with this whole movie, is I think the script was flawed from the start. They were trying to walk that line of kind of raunchy, gross parody humor and family-friendly, adorable duck adventure. And that's not going to be successful.
I think it's extremely well, like we mentioned early in the movie, there's a scene where very clearly what's going on is an attempted rape. And also in that scene, Howard starts making jokes about quack foo and like
It's a little
kick somebody in the balls.
It's a little racist there. Yeah.
Yeah, that's also
There's multiple layers, but yeah.
The quack fu was a direct making fun of Shang-Chi, the comic book character. That's why he does kung fu. That's anyway.
Got it.
But
I'm just saying they vacillate between these scenes of very intense subject matter or weird sexualization and flirting, and then these absolutely absurd duck puns that are so.
I remember
she pulls a fucking condom out of Howard's wallet.
In the first 5 minutes of the movie, when he's being sucked out of the vortex, he goes through. There's a topless duck singing in the shower. Two topless, and full breasts and everything. Duck breasts, but breasts nonetheless. And that's why I'm like, who is this? I think I'm giving you a point, Morph, because that's exactly why I think this script was totally flawed from the begin with, because they didn't know if we're going to make this for kids to come in and buy a bunch of Howard the Duck toys, or if we're going to make this for teenagers to yuck up about naked duck breasts or whatever.
Well, I can tell you what this was like to see as a 7-year-old, because I remember this, because this movie came out and they put it on HBO, and I remember my mom was like, "Oh, it's Howard the Duck. It's something from George Lucas. You'll love it. It's probably not good, but you'll love it." And I remember it was the first time watching a movie with my mother where I had gotten old enough where she was at that point where she wasn't sure what she needed to censor and not around me. And I just remember that the opening scene happened with the boobs twice, and she kept putting her hand over my eyes. And it was one of these things where I'm like, I don't know if that's going to make any difference for my enjoyment of this movie. Yeah, it was extremely distressing as a child.
I wonder if, and this is again, and I'm not even the biggest fan of this movie. I think in part because I think people who are a little older than me love it a little more. Maybe Chris's age or even older than that. But I wonder also if this is a Ghostbusters runoff thing, because Ghostbusters was pretty popular with kids. People wanted to buy Slimer, aka Onion Head toys, and Venkman dolls and all that shit. They could merchandise it to kids, but the movie itself does have a fair amount of adult jokes and material. Dana and Bill Murray have
Dan Aykroyd getting a blowjob from a ghost. Yeah, there's all kinds of this man has a small dick, stuff like that. So it simultaneously was able to appeal to kids and the kind of people who maybe saw Animal House at that same era. Well, and I think they maybe wanted to do that with Howard the Duck, but they were just failed in the most fundamental way.
Well, I'm wondering if this was a general thing about that age range, because we're talking about boomers. We're talking about baby boomers in this, because that would be the age where they'd be in their 30s when this movie came out and kind of be the public who would be bringing their kids to it. I noticed that a lot of movies came out that were marketed towards parents more than kids, but kids would get brought along anyway. So really intense movies that you wouldn't think to bring a child to, Total Recall, all the Arnold Schwarzenegger movies, all the really intense Arnold Schwarzenegger movies, were all huge movies.
Even the
for
first
kids.
Terminator.
Yeah, kids would get taken to those by their parents, and it would just be kind of a thing where it's it's not even a thing to think about. Rambo, he was killing people left and right, and they didn't have any issues about bringing their kids. Now, that's changed. I remember even when I was a kid, or shouldn't say a kid, when I was 20 and I was working at a movie theater, everybody looked weird when people were bringing their toddlers into Fight Club, right?
Yeah.
Because that's a really intense, bad choice, but people wouldn't think anything about taking them to see, any of these movies where people were being killed, Total Recall, people's eyes almost explode, Predator, yeah.
There's a degree, and there's I suppose there's a degree of that to this day in terms of obviously in the MCU movies, I mean, a lot of people die in those movies. They just don't die as violently as they would in a Rambo or a Terminator.
Sure. But
they're bloodless deaths, kind of.
The problem with the MCU is the same problem you have with Marvel in general, is that there are no consequences. Everybody always comes back.
Sure.
You can kill them 1,000 times.
Well, the regular people who die don't come back, but they don't matter. The movies aren't interested in the civilians.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
I mean, I will probably the MCU is probably going to do a little bit better than the actual comic books because they're not going to bring back Robert Downey Jr. for Tony Stark. They're not going to bring back Chris Evans for Steve Rogers. But in the comic book, they definitely would. Right? Yeah. Rogers and Stark, they're coming back. You better.
Well, like it's the same thing as like the DCEMU, the DCEU. Like Zach kind of said, like they don't care about the everyday people. Like the godlike people are the only ones who really matter.
Maybe even worse in the DC.
It's worse in DC. Yeah. At least in Marvel, they make an attempt. Like they will go out of their way to try to save random bystander. In Superman versus Batman, I mean, they just smash buildings all the time.
Yeah, they give two fucks about the building, the 9/11s they're causing every 5 seconds.
Yeah.
Zack Snyder is not. I think Zack Snyder's Randian instincts come through, and that like the normal human is not something he's deeply concerned about. He's only concerned about the special super people. I think that's fundamental to his DNA.
Well, it's funny when he makes the movie that doesn't have superheroes in it, like 300 or even like Army of the Dead, which I just watched, because much like his other films, everyday people don't matter. The things that happen to them don't matter. So when the main characters are everyday people, nothing that happens in the movie matters. Mm-hmm. So it's like Army of the Dead. I didn't have any confusion as to what was going to happen, and it didn't do anything surprising, and everybody died. Spoiler warning.
To be fair,
everybody
in 300, part of the point is that the main characters are like super fascists who were like raised to be perfect authoritarian drones.
Yeah, well, that's probably a bad choice, but I meant like the other people, like maybe the people who's still working in the town of 300, where they weren't the people on the front lines, like someone who's just making fish. You know, Sparta, like the Spartan fishermen were just getting ignored.
Well, I mean, that's 300's written by Frank Miller, and we're surprised that it's full of jingoistic fucking nonsense, you know.
Sure, and the DCEU takes a lot from The Dark Knight Rises, so there you go.
Right, yeah. But, which, you know...
Or The Dark Knight Returns, my
mistake. Not The Dark Knight Rises. That's a different... So I think that, like, that's the biggest flaw in this. That's the number one flaw. The second flaw in this movie, I think, was they should have foreshadowed this Dark Overlord a little bit earlier. I mean, I think they should have included that more in the beginning scenes rather than just Howard wandering around wondering what am I doing here.
I'm going to continue this egalitarian thing we've had this round and give Russell one of my points because for me, one of the biggest problems of this movie is indeed that the first half and the second half feel like two entirely different films.
Yeah.
And it's because there's no, like Jeffrey Jones shows up and at that point we're in a different fucking movie than we were for everything that preceded.
It's crazy because it feels like the movie woke up a little bit. Like it doesn't it didn't lay any of the traps early, so there's no reason to know why anything's happening. But at the same time, it starts occurring.
The first movie about Howard the Duck just being a fish out of water finding his way on Earth climaxes during that very special scene, if you will, if you'll allow it.
Yes, they're
and then
moments
the next
away
from
a cloacal kiss, as the chickens like to call it. The sex, just out of the context of this, like, absurdism only works when you don't really stop to ask questions. Like, if it's just funny and goofy, as soon as they start making realistic choices, like he's going to have on-screen, like, flirtation with this lady, or when boobs appear on a duck, you're like, what the hell is going on downstairs with that animal? Because, like, normal ducks have cloacas, and they do not have boobs. Ducks don't eat milk.
Yeah. I mean, but male ducks, obviously, male ducks still have a penis. It is corkscrew shaped, if I recall correctly.
It's like 5 feet long, and almost every duck passion, if you will, is essentially one duck forcing himself on another duck that was unaware that this long, fleshy tendril is about to attack it from underneath the water.
I have learned a lot more about duck reproduction than I care to. That's why. But I mean, again, that because they make fun of that in the comic books. That all the superheroes, women just throw themselves at it, and it's just funny that it's Howard the Duck that Beverly's the one who's and that can work. That can work as an absurdist concept.
A comic, that
in a comic,
In a live action scene, it's just like very distressing.
And I mean, I think if they tried to do this movie with a little bit more self-awareness that the comic books had, a little bit more meta. You don't have to go full on Deadpool, but that should be more like what you're trying to do with this movie. It should be a lot more like, isn't this a lot of fun and a joke the whole time? Like that's really what but it kept, even the score, the John Barry score is like this kind of whimsical Star Wars romance stuff, like it doesn't track well with, I think, what A, the tone of Howard the Duck, the comic books, and B, this sort of half-ass tone that they tried to make into this movie.
And you have these absolutely absurdist jokes, but also I think there's a level where they want us to take like the threat of the Dark Overlord kind of seriously, instead of, if you're going to go that absurdist, make everything fucking absurd. Make it all a cartoon or none of it. And like, don't pretend the Dark Overlord is a genuine threat to the human race at all.
Right. And keep going with the kind of crazy, stupid bad guys that they have in the comic books, like the cosmic accountant and that kind of stuff. You can have fun with it.
Here's a question.
To make this a fantasy adventure, and it fails.
Well, here's my question to you guys. Do you think that the reason that they did that was completely budget-based? Because you look at something like Star Wars, they actually had enough of a budget to run around and do stuff, and this one still was an expensive movie, but do you think that some of the weirdness with the first part of this movie, just being people walking and talking basically, had to do with the fact that it was very hard to shoot with that animatronic? Like they did like a couple action sequences where it was essentially someone being chased.
To be fair, it's I just want to clarify, that's a suit. Like there's a guy in there. Like when you see the side of the profile, Shannon noted how wide the head looks. That's because there's a little guy who had to put that fucking head on top of his head. And like I mentioned this earlier, it's the same actor who did Chucky in the Child's Play movies. The body, obviously, not Brad Dourif. But yeah, so it is like a little guy in there doing the.
And I can
acting.
even, even in today's sort of like CGI orgy of every blockbuster that you see, it is refreshing, because like I think about the first Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie, the New Line one, and like those animatronics aren't that dissimilar from Howard, and I thought nobody complained about that. Granted, that was Jim Henson, and this was kind of Lucas saying, "I'm going to be my own Jim Henson." So like I said, I didn't think Howard the Duck, the animatronic, and the guy looked all that bad. I thought it looked okay considering the time, and I actually appreciated the fact that it was actually something you could fucking dunk into water and shit, and it's actually a thing rather than like this green sponge that everybody's having to react to. So there's some benefit to that, but it's also the constraint of the times too. They just didn't. That the Dark Overlord, when you finally reveal the monstrosity that it actually is, was a pretty good looking kind of monster thing.
It's claymation.
It was fine. Yeah, and that's cool. I dig it.
But my question would just. Well, I'm just wondering if it was like they blew all their budget at the end, kind of. Because it was one of those things where it's like they had a bunch of action sequences throughout it, but nothing that was shot in a way that was really exciting. Like, that's kind of the thing that hits me with this time period, because there's like a couple films that came out close-ish to this time period where it almost feels like sitcom staging, where they would show people in kind of wides, like someone comes in from the left, someone comes in from the right. And it just felt very static. Like even like high speed moments, like when he's riding on his little cart and he's got the laser, they do some spin outs and stuff. But you'd have to imagine that if you're on the thing running, it would probably be more exciting, or to do like a POV of him driving as opposed to a wide shot where he spins out. I don't know. It was stuff like that where I couldn't get a sense of action or excitement. And a lot of the action sequences had no actual impact on the story. They were just things to get him doing to kind of keep enough filler in there and enough movement that people wouldn't get bored.
It's kind of like The Mummy, right? Where you're just like going from one chase scene to another chase scene, and there's no really rhyme or reason for it. And what is with Universal doing this? And that's why I wonder, maybe it's not just budget. Maybe Universal put their thumb on the scales a little bit to try to say, no, we need to market this for kids, because kids have got to see it, and they're the ones who go to the goddamn movies. We need to, we're going to make a bunch of little Howard the Duck dolls and, that kind of thing. So I wonder how much that had to do with it as well. Because it does sound like the production kind of ran over, like Tim Robbins tells a story where he was only supposed to be on for like a week, and he ended up being like on there for much longer, and he was happy because he got the overtime. And I will say, for performances from the humans, Leah Thompson, Jeffrey Jones, and Tim Robbins, they're fine. I thought Jeffrey Jones, like playing the way he changes his voice and his face, it's pretty cartoony, but it worked. I kind of liked it.
Sure.
Yeah.
And Leah Thompson has to do a lot of heavy lifting in this movie, and I guess I give her credit for that because she has to pretty much do everything.
Well, I mean, how did you guys feel about that? Did it seem like they were almost doing something more like 1950s style, or something that felt like it was on a sitcom kind of?
Yes.
Because that was the thing. It was like very
Tim
broad.
Robbins as well, I think, is on that same page.
Yes.
Yeah, but it's like it's open and it's clear slapstick. So it's like I always feel bad for the actors in this because a lot of them did what they were supposed to. They showed up, they worked hard, they went broad when they were supposed to, gave the film and the directors what they asked for. However, it destroyed Leah Thompson's career for a while.
Yeah.
Like,
I think probably she's never fully recovered.
well, here's a funny story about this, because I do want to just say one thing I found in trivia on this. Leah Thompson did Howard the Duck, and this was coming off from having done Back to the Future.
Briefly before you say this, we should say, as of date of recording, happy 60th birthday.
Hey, happy
Leah
birthday,
Thompson.
Leah
Happy
So there you
60th
go.
birthday.
We're celebrating. We are celebrating by diving into one of your cinematic gems, Leah Thompson.
She was 25 in this movie.
Not bad for a
man.
lead, you know.
No, it's not bad. Like, she came hot off of doing Back to the Future. She'd done the first one, not the sequels yet. And, you know, she was 25. She was extremely pretty. She was extremely charismatic. This film killed her career. She couldn't get a call. And she wound up doing, after this, a movie called Some Kind of Wonderful, which is funny because what essentially happened is I think she ended up dating Eric Stoltz for a little while, who was the main actor on that. But she actually got married to the director of that. And the reason that she did Some Like It or Some Kind of Wonderful is because of Howard the Duck. Like, it was a script she turned down, and then she went back and said, yes, I'll go ahead and do it. But that's still the same guy she's married to. She's got like a couple kids. So somehow Howard the Duck short-circuited her career, but turned into like a love match after a while.
Just
kind of
like
funny.
Pixar, you know, there's always silver linings to every Howard the Duck. And I don't blame her. You know, like I've got to take whatever call I get because I don't know if the phone's ever going to ring again after Howard the Duck, you know? And it's, you know, Hollywood's so weird like that, isn't it? Where like if a movie goes really terribly, it's like everybody gets the blame for it, no matter how competent or accomplished. It typically happens with, you know, younger, newer actors and that kind of stuff. But it is funny how they get kind of the shit for something that isn't really their fault. They're there to just do their job. And for what it's worth, Leah Thompson, Tim Robbins, Jeffrey Jones, they showed up. They did their job. I mean, hell, like I said, even the movie itself, production-wise, is competent. You know, it's a competently made movie. There's nothing in there that's totally like, well, Jesus, did you guys run out of money for something? You know, it's not like Cross of Iron or something where they ran out of film. Like it's a competently made movie, and you could see where there are points in this movie where had it made one turn or another, it probably would have worked better. But I'm kind of with you, Zach. I think that a title like Howard the Duck really only works in the comic book form. I mean, you could do it in, you know, like I know Patton Oswalt's got that new MODOK show, and it's more like a Robot Chicken sort of comedy thing. You could maybe do something like that. Sure. But to make it like a kind of E.T. kind of movie, you know, where, you know, it's just your plucky little alien buddy, it's not going to work, you know, and still try to do the acerbic humor that is known for Howard the Duck. Like a lot of the humor in this movie isn't really from Howard. It's all these visual gags and all these fucking puns or whatever, his, you know, duck related credit cards or whatever. You know, and then even the restaurant where they go at, where Jeffrey Jones lays out the whole plot of the movie, I guess. I mean, they serve Cajun sushi. I've never heard of Cajun sushi. It's a new concept to me. I don't know if that was supposed to be a joke, but there was a lot of, you know, the parodies of the visual gags, I think, was a lot of what was trying to be the thrust of this humor. And then, of course, you know, but, and again, a lot of Howard's jokes probably would have played a lot better had they had a better voice actor. I mean, the guy, I don't want to trash on him, but he just didn't fit. I mean, I heard Steve Buscemi's voice. When I read Howard the Duck, I hear Steve Buscemi. And I think if you had gotten that guy, because apparently they wanted John Cusack. I don't even know how that would work, other than just him and Tim Robbins are buddies. But like I totally wrong-headed about this movie, about where this title should do.
So what, just out of curiosity, what circumstances did you guys first see or become aware of Howard the Duck, or like watch the movie?
I became aware of Howard the Duck when I was very young. My mom worked at the library, so we would always rent libraries from this, so I would spend a lot of time, and I can't remember. I was with a neighbor friend of mine. I think his name was Steve. I can't remember, but he pointed out Howard the Duck and said it was the same guy who did Star Wars. And I was like, well, okay. He rented it. I didn't. I was like, well, that seems pretty dumb. I'm not interested. I thought, and so I didn't even know he was a Marvel thing until I was like a grown up. I didn't even know that was like a Marvel thing. And then I read this book about the history of Marvel, learned all about Steve Gerber and what kind of a, Steve Gerber, he was so incensed by Marvel. He literally goes to DC and just creates another Howard the Duck called Destroyer Duck. And he does it with Image, and he basically stuck on this just to stick it to Marvel. And it should be said, Steve Gerber was signed off on this. I mean, he was invited to go to set. He never had time to, because part of the reason why him and Marvel never got along is because he was always late. He was never met a deadline he could meet. So he shows up at the last day of shooting. He kind of gives it its blessing, and then he saw the movie, and he was like, "Well, that's not really what Howard the Duck." He kind of pumps his own tires a little bit more than he probably should, because I think he tries to layer in this, like I said, this kind of pop philosophy in there. There's a lot of existentialism in there, and that you could tell that like in the 70s, a lot of people were like, "That's fucking far out, man," and it kind of shared that kind of like anti-establishment, carrying over from the 60s. And and Steve Gerber only worked in comic books. He always flirted with trying to do novels or screenplays or something, but his wife, when he died, he said like he could never give it up. He could never give up the comics. He just never. And for what it's worth, every editor in Marvel, including today Joe Quesada, has said like the only person who could really write Howard the Duck well was Steve Gerber. He was the only person who could do it. And that's why I think, Zach, I'll let you answer Borf's question, because like that's I've only heard of it of legend. I know it bombed, and I knew of the comic book peripherally.
Yeah, I'd never seen it before. I've been aware of it for I don't know how long, a long time. I mean, I've heard about it at some point in the past. I'm sure I've seen like stills from it. I've listened to podcasts about bad movies for at least 10 to 12 years. So I'm sure they've talked about it on at least a couple of those. I just kind of knew about it peripherally. I knew it was like a real weird little thing, weird little footnote in history. I had never really put together that, something Russell mentioned, that it was technically the first full-length big-screen Marvel movie. There was, like, in 1944, apparently,
Captain
like, some
America.
serials cut together from what was then Timely Comics of Captain America.
That's right.
And this was the last one fully theatrically released in the United States until Blade in 1998, at which point they kind of became, what they are today. Like, they got the X-Men and Spider-Man, and then eventually the MCU happened.
Sure. And then a little bit, I mean, the closest thing they got to successful before, to getting anything out there before Howard, was the Incredible Hulk TV show, and that actually was successful.
Yeah, they had some, for sure. And they had, like, in the 90s, they had, like, those animated Marvel shows.
For sure,
But, I don't know. That I knew about it peripherally, too. I'd never seen it before doing this podcast.
It's funny, I didn't actually know it was a Marvel thing until I saw it appear in Guardians of the Galaxy. Like, when he shows up at the end, I just started laughing out of confusion, because I was like, it's a fucking talking duck. Is this Howard the Duck? This can't be Howard the Duck. And then I looked it up, I'm like, oh my god, he's actually a Marvel character. And I got so excited, I told Sarah about it. She had no idea who Howard the Duck was. I didn't build up Howard the Duck as the movie, but she was curious to see how terrible it was. And this was early on when we were dating, so we watched Howard the Duck. And leading up to that point, we were still going through that awkward phase where we hadn't told each other that we loved each other yet. It was still like, I like you so much.
And it was while watching Howard the Duck.
No, it was actually that we watched Howard the Duck, and the next day she had to say it to me because she was like, I am not attaching that movie to the first time we said that. So the fact that we watched this essentially preempted what she had planned to say to me. And like us doing the first time saying we loved each other was preempted completely because of Howard the Duck by at least a day. So yeah,
it still seems like it's connected. It seems like her attempt failed, and it's still connected.
It's connected for me. It makes me laugh every time I think of Howard the Duck. But it's just
though we might, Borf, we cannot change our own history. History is written in stone. But that's why Borf, you probably have a better beat on this than I do, because like even though this movie bombed fantastically and it's sort of famous of being like a not good movie that bombed, but there is a weird cult following to this movie. And I think I wanted to ask that, because there was a cult following with the comic book. Does that, like, what is with Howard the Duck and people loving it? I like I said, even me reading the Gerber run, I'm like, it's fine. But like,
that's a good question. I don't know what people see in Howard the Duck, but I think I can understand that, like, this is probably the early sense of like what the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were eventually.
For sure.
It was probably like, an introduction to sort of counterculture stuff. There were some books that had come out where they'd started getting meta. There's like a movie, or there's a book called Super Folks. I can't remember who the writer was, but it was like a comic book writer. It was the first time they did a meta thing where it was like this guy who used to be Superman, or like whatever they called him, having like average middle life crisis problems. It was a pretty boring book, but that was the whole bit of it. So the idea of taking the comic book themes and applying adult concepts to them was still pretty novel, and people were doing that and going, oh, this is so crazy that this comic is now having problems with his wife or something like that. Like whatever happened to the Man of Tomorrow, the Alan Moore comic, kind of dove headfirst into that stuff.
Also, it's helpful because your vessel in those adult themes in the comic world is a cartoon duck. I mean, it's basically a suit and tied version of Donald Duck. I mean, he looks like fucking Donald. So like that's why I think it kind of, and again, like you brought up Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, I think that's a fair thing, because Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles itself was also sort of supposed to be like a parody off of Daredevil. Like the foot soldiers are supposed to be the hand, and everybody's a fantastic ninja or whatever. So like Howard the Duck's kind of in that similar vein. And I guess from that, but it's also the same thing. I've never really understood the appeal to Deadpool either. I've never understood it. People love fucking Deadpool, and I've just never been that kind of guy. I've just never really found like the constant looking to the camera and winking at me. I'm never. That's just not
some
me.
people just really like meta for some reason. Like it's a thing. It got real big in the '80s and kind of through the '90s. Gen Xers love meta. I've never really been that into meta. It kind of bores me.
It can work, but if it's the whole movie, I usually check out. Like I think of the meta scene in Spaceballs, where they actually rent the movie and rewind it. Like that's funny.
Well, that's like one scene.
It's used as a gag.
Yeah, it's one scene, and it's in a comedy too. Like it's in something that's actually funny. Like I think this meta stuff is acceptable in something that's actually funny. Like I've noticed when you get meta in things that aren't comedy, and you're making comments, it stops being enjoyable. Like if you're watching
Funny Games?
Funny Games is a good example. Horror films are like real bad when they get meta, in my opinion. And I don't know. It seems like it gets top heavy for everything else. Like comedy is kind of always about making a comment on a thing, but horror seems like, you're trying to make a deeper question than just meta. So it just being about a thing isn't as, it's not evocative of any emotion for me. Like I'm not going to laugh at a horror film, but I'd laugh at a comedy that makes the same point. I don't know.
Yeah, I've just never understood the cult following behind. I mean, I can understand the cult following behind this movie more than I can the actual character, just because, Zach, you're a fan. You can watch bad movies. There is a type of people who will watch bad movies for enjoyment. I mean, like,
sure.
I'm kind of like that too.
Unique ones, yeah.
Yeah, Rock and Roll Picture Show, yeah.
Yeah, well,
right, and I think, I mean, let's just emphasize the point. Like, there's a difference between this movie and what we watched previously with The Mummy, which is like such standard boilerplate pablum that there's almost nothing there. This is baffling and interesting, and thinking about the decisions is fascinating.
Sure. Yeah. And for what it's worth, I had a better time watching this movie than I did The Mummy, even though The Mummy, like I said off air, like The Mummy was a roller coaster ride that I don't ever want to ride again, but at least it was a ride, at least at least I this one was more of like, the legend behind this movie is so pervasive that like I'm already kind of buckled up and know what I'm getting into in a little bit. So because of that, I kind of like, I knew what I was getting into, and it's exactly what I thought it was.
It's much more fun to watch a movie make bad decisions than to make no decisions.
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. And this movie also, I think, I don't know how you guys feel about it, but I think that it got pointed out as like worst film ever a little more than it deserved.
I agree.
Because
it's not the worst film ever.
Yeah. It's like they really went all in on that back in the 80s and 90s. They were saying it was like a horrible bomb, and it is only kind of a bomb. It made basically even. It made like 21 back off 19 investment. Tucker did way worse than this, and that one got way more critical acclaim. But even like this movie got a bunch of Razzie Awards. It was like a popularity thing. I think in modern times, this would probably come out on a streaming service and people would have forgotten it.
Yeah. Like, and Razzies were kind of new at that point too. So it was kind of a newer thing. So they would jump on anything. But like, that's why I felt some of the critics, because I was reading some of the reviews at the time I was reading. Some of it's very earned. Some of the shit that this movie gets very earned. Some of it I felt was like, well, like, I don't know what's your big problem with the way the duck look. I think your real problem is the way the duck sounded, not the way it looked. And I think we're because again, the fucking Teenage Ninja Turtles movie is not that far away from here, and it's essentially the same technology, and nobody ever complained about the way they looked.
Yeah, but it was also like an action movie that was intended for like 13 to 14-year-olds, and it looked correct for what it was, and it was dark, and it's not a good movie in hindsight, but it was dark and tone accurate for the age range of the people watching it, so you weren't sitting there as a 7-year-old going, why are there boobs on a duck? Yeah. Yeah, and also, I mean, the movie Teenage Ninja Turtles didn't have any. There wasn't a studio putting the thumb on the scales either. That was a mostly independent movie. With this one, I mean, again, I find it funny that this is Universal. Again, we are having to talk about, because a lot of people at Universal lost their jobs over this fucking movie. I wonder how many people got fired for Mummy, because it seems like Universal does have this kind of this energy to go pick up a goddamn franchise and like we're gonna make our own goddamn Star Wars. I think they approached it with that exact mindset. Like they thought this was like a land grab because they'd missed out on Star Wars, and they thought this was going to be the Star Wars they could buy from George Lucas, and found out it was just a bad movie, not good.
Huh. Yeah, and it shows. Like I said, it shows.
Okay.
I would say Willow was a lot more fun. I was going to check if my pick
was also... I checked to see if my movie was also Universal, but it is not. So
okay, well, at least 2 out of 3 ain't bad. Well, I guess since we're already kind of flirting with the idea, you guys want to move on to final thoughts? Have we defeathered this bird as much as possible? Also, or if you're more of a cook than I am, do you season the duck before you put on the feathers? Before you remove the feathers of a duck? I don't think that's how seasoning works.
If you're trying to break down that scene, it's there's a lot of questions. I think we're going into final thoughts, and I'll just dive in, I guess. My final thoughts are that this film's not very good, and its handling of race as like the duck race versus the human race was super uncomfortable. Because it feels like the Geico cavemen. Like the bit in the commercials works, but when they tried to do a TV show, and it became pretty clear that they were trying to do a race conversation using the caveman thing. In this case, they have a thing where they're trying to have kind of a race conversation involving the duck thing, but they're using that to ignore any of the underlying racial issues. So like when he goes to the public assistance thing, they have a black lady lecturing him about how lazy he is. And it's like, I can tell a white person wrote this, and they are saying something a lot more racist than what they think they're saying. And they have a duck who's being yelled at because of his appearance as being lazy and an excuse to not work. Not to mention the other stuff. But in that sequence, it felt like we were watching like a lynching. Like it was supposed to be like rednecks lynching a dude in the kitchen. Like another film that came out around this time that is a real uncomfortable thing would have been the oh my god, it was the not Sissy Spacek, the other actress who always gets confused with Sissy Spacek.
Mia Farrow? Piper
No.
Laurie? I don't know.
Is there a film that she's in that you could give us?
You could give me any.
A little girl who lives down the lane. We watched her in a movie. We just watched her in a movie. It was Jodie Foster.
Oh. Okay.
Jodie Foster was in a
movie. Her with Sissy Spacek.
Sorry, it was just my brain. But she was in a movie earlier that dealt with an actual like rape that had occurred, and it, if I'm not mistaken, was handled in a very similar way to this sequence, which is really uncomfortable to see in a children's film for multiple levels. So, my final thoughts are: this film was not intended for anyone, and it should have ended up in a landfill. That's my final thought.
I think that's wholly fair. Zach, do you want to give your final thoughts, and then I can give mine, and we could go through the.
Yeah, this is I mean, the thing, Chris is kind of right. This is several movies, several versions of this movie that kind of ended up mashed together as one. Like we said, both in terms of the plot, where the first half of the movie and the second half of the movie are like, one's a fish out of water comedy story, and the other one's like an intergalactic, gotta stop the alien invasion thing. The humor pings from being very childish, like duck hunt references, to very adult, like overly sexual flirtation scenes. And I still think that it's because there were a couple movies in the years prior to this, like Ghostbusters and even Back to the Future, that I think did manage to walk that tightrope. And Howard the Duck wanted to walk that tightrope. And I think it's from the beginning, having the central character be this duck doomed that tightrope walk from the beginning. Like, you could have Howard the Duck as a side character in a movie where the main character is human and probably pull that off. But
yeah, I mean, that would be a good example of Who Framed Roger Rabbit, for example, where Bob Hoskins is essentially the main character.
Right, exactly. But in this, like, they just badly miscalculated that balance, and instead of making the kind of movie where anybody who watches it can find something to enjoy, they made a movie where anybody who watches it can find something they hate. And so it's just the perfect like the chemistry. They put in the wrong potion at one point, and what should have been turning lead into gold turned lead into ricin.
I guess, like, for me, it's a tough property to adapt anyway. Like, this is a tough sell to adapt the comic books Howard the Duck into a movie. I think some script choices could have saved this movie, but I doubt it. If they had chose to go with a particular tone rather than trying to do the tightrope dance that was so prevalent in the 80s of like, well, we got to make it for grown-ups, but the kids have got to have a good time too. So we'll throw in some cute stuff, and thus they might want to buy a little Howard the Duck doll. And because it's so inconsistent in its tone, everything falls flat. Everything's a disaster. It's a competently made movie that has some pretty okay set special effects. The stunt works okay. The performances are pretty good. Like, Tim Robbins hams it up. Jeffrey Jones as well. I think Leah Thompson gets an unfair rap for this movie when really she was doing all the work. So I give her some credit for that. And then I will say I've never seen it before, so it's an odd thing in cinematic history to you could watch it for educational purposes, just to see what the eyesore of this movie is. I mean, it is so your brain has to work so hard to try to make the jokes work in this movie. I mean, you have to really, really go for it and maybe it's just because that was the humor at the time, but I mean, there are other comedies that came out in the 80s that I at least laughed at. I think I only laughed 1 point at this movie, and that was the Duck Hunt references. And I sort of wish, boy, if we had some sort of payoff at the beginning or something to set up this fucking gag, that would have worked. But there's nothing. There's just shitty duck puns on fucking movie posters. It's not good. They give a lot of crap to the way the duck looks. I didn't have a problem with the way the duck looks, but boy, if you're going to have your main character be an animatronic duck, it would really be helpful if you knew what he was going to sound like. You have to look at and hear that voice. You know, you have to be, I mean, like even in like Guardians nowadays, like Rocket Raccoon, it's not an actual raccoon. Brad Cooper doesn't come in there and read the fucking lines. They have some guy in there, but it's the same guy. And they already know what the voice is going to sound like. So like there's still a target that they're shooting for. For this one, they tried to nail the bullseye without actually notching the arrow. You know, like they didn't actually get to the heart of the character, and that's why it fails from the beginning. This movie is it is nice to watch as a spectacular failure. You know, you're like, wow, there's so many things went wrong in this movie that could have made it better, but I doubt it. I just think that Howard the Duck's an impossible property to fucking adapt. And again, Steve Gerber being a creature of comic books, I think he would probably agree because he's only done comic books. So, yeah. So that's my final thoughts on Howard the Duck. I'm glad I got to trap you guys for that one. That was worth it for me because you know, anytime I could bring the pain, I'm very happy.
And it was nice. It was nice being able to hear more Thomas Dolby music, which always takes me back to the '80s and makes me wish that I was in the '90s instead.
Yeah,
grunge was
John
better
Barry
than New Age.
showed up on this.
Yep.
John Barry shows up on. I mean, James Bond. I mean, that estate's gonna be just fine because of that piece of music. But then you look at anything else he's done after that, like Star Crash and blah. You know, not good. Okay, so that was Howard the Duck. Real quick before we get to our final movie in the failed franchises theme, let's do a quick rundown of the points. Basically, we are all at 12 points, and Chris, you have one more point to give out. You got a point from me because of the flaws in the script. I got a point from Zach because of the Dark Overlord not foreshadowing, and Zach got a point from Chris about the Pixar history. So at least, you know, silver lining to every Howard the Duck. So yeah, that's where it all stands. We're all at 12 points, and we all have one more point to give. So with that in mind, Zach Powers, what are you going to trap us in?
Yeah. So like I said, this was one of those rounds where I was like, there's a lot of ways I could go. There are ringers out there that I could have picked. Like, I think that, for instance, a movie like, you know, that Dread movie from a few years ago.
For sure.
Genuinely a good movie. Failed to start a franchise. Or The Rocketeer has I've never seen it, but that has a nice reputation, and it failed to start a franchise. But then there's a lot of like really interesting movies out there that I was considering watching. I would love to force you guys, for instance, someday to watch Hudson Hawk, because I think that would be so fucking weird. But ultimately, I decided not to do a ringer. I still might win anyway because your movies were so bad. And I decided to do something that seems fascinating to me, seems very interesting. Wanted to be a passion project of one man. They wanted it to be a franchise, not unlike Howard the Duck, based on a comic. And that is 1990's Dick Tracy. Dick Tracy, starring Warren Beatty. Passion project.
The only other movie of Warren Beatty you guys have seen?
All-star fucking cast.
I've never seen this.
You've
All-star
never seen
cast.
Dick Tracy? Oh my
I've
God.
never seen it either.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, people have talked to me about it a lot. I've never seen it. They always talk about
All-star
cinematography.
cast.
Yeah.
Yeah, cinematography looks great. Very well performed. I mean, over the top performances by Al Pacino, but we're in the '90s Al Pacino era. You know what I'm saying? Like where he's pretty much just screaming. All
I mean,
the
it's
time.
got Madonna in the movie as an actress. So it was a hard sell for me at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I've never seen it, but I mean, its reviews on Rotten Tomato are not great, but they're better than any of the 2 movies we watched so far.
It's certainly.
probably
I know it's
true.
better than Howard the Duck. I know it's better than Howard the Duck. Okay, Dick Tracy, Warren Beatty, another Warren Beatty, not the handsome, rugged reporter. Now we're going with the kind of older, grizzled.
We're doing the serious version of the Duck movie we just watched. That's what's happening. We're watching Howard the Duck as a real story called Dick Tracy.
Okay. Alrighty, well, I guess with that, we could go ahead and sign off, and we could fly off back to Duckburg or wherever we live, and yeah, and we will see you guys next time for Dick Tracy. And it'll be for the final round, so they'll be voting, and we will get a new theme next episode from whoever wins, which I get the feeling it's not going to be Howard the Duck. Alrighty, folks. Well, thank you so much for listening. I've been Russell Carlson. For my co-host, Chris Borough.
Catch that duck.
And for my other co-host, Zach Bowers.
He has a little duck condom.
And always remember, folks, Diane Ladd is too young to play Chevy Chase's mom.
Across the sea of stars lies another world, a world almost exactly like ours. This is where he lives. He's 27 years old, single but searching. Favorite sports, windsurfing and Aikido. Favorite pastimes, cigars and sex. He has everything except fulfillment. And then one night, it happens.
Hey, good buddy, are you home?
He has a very sudden midlife crisis. He lands in Cleveland.
You do know why you were sent to me?
Listen to me, small visitor. I can explain how you got here.
Maybe you're here for some greater purpose, some cosmic cause.
Here, he's forced to reassess his career goals,
You went to med school?
to explore new relationships, to redefine his self-image,
I'm sorry, we don't allow pets on the premises.
to adjust to a changing lifestyle. Until he discovers just who he really is.
Oh, no.
A duck in big trouble.
That's a duck, man.
Howard the Duck, trapped in a world he never made.